0654. June 15, 1826, Constantinople. The midday sun hangs over the great square of At-Maidani, the ancient hippodrome where Byzantine emperors once raced chariots. Today, it holds a different kind of spectacle. Thousands of men in tall white felt caps are dragging their massive copper cooking cauldrons into the open square. One by one, they flip them upside down onto the cobblestones. The sound echoes off the walls of the Blue Mosque. Every shopkeeper in the bazaar knows what that sound means. Every diplomat in every foreign embassy is already drafting urgent letters home. The Janissaries have overturned their cauldrons. They have done this before. In the last 200 years, this ritual has deposed 4 sultans and murdered 2 of them outright. The cauldrons are not just cookware. They are the symbol of the corps itself, the regimental hearth around which these men eat, sleep, and decide which sultan lives and which one dies. When the cauldrons turn over, the sultan turns over. If you are looking for the Janissary Massacre true story, this is the brutal reality. The men in those white caps believe they are about to repeat history. They believe Sultan Mahmud II will beg, negotiate, exile a few advisors, and continue paying their inflated salaries. They expect tonight to end the way 1622 ended, the way 1730 ended, the way 1807 ended, with another dead reformer on the harem floor. They do not yet understand that Mahmud II has been waiting 18 years for exactly this moment. The trap was set before most of the men in this square were even born. Before today is over, between 6,000 and 20,000 of them will be dead. The 500-year-old corps that conquered Constantinople, that smashed Christian armies at Mohacs and Varna, that once made European kings tremble, will cease to exist by sunset. This is not a story about a tyrant crushing his army. This is a story about an institution that ate the empire it was built to protect, and the cold, patient, 18-year-long act of revenge that finally ended it. Before we walk through that long afternoon, please like and subscribe for more hidden corners of history. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to what a Janissary actually was, because the cinematic image you have in your head is almost certainly wrong. The popular picture of the Janissary is a museum fiction. You probably imagine a holy warrior, a devoted slave soldier of the Sultan, a disciplined elite trained from childhood, sworn to celibacy, marching in perfect ranks beneath a green banner. Maybe you have seen the paintings, the towering plumed headgear, the long musket, the curved killage sword. That Janissary did exist. He existed in 1450. He existed at the gates of Vienna in 1529. By 1826, he had been dead for 2 centuries, and the institution wearing his uniform had become something else entirely. The original corps was created in the 14th century under Sultan Murad I. The system was called the Devshirme, a word that translates roughly to the gathering. Ottoman officials would ride through Christian villages in the Balkans and select healthy boys, typically between 8 and 18 years old. The boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained for years in elite military schools. They were forbidden from marrying. They were forbidden from owning private property. They were forbidden from learning any trade except war. Their salary came directly from the Sultan, and their loyalty was supposed to be absolute. It was, for a while, one of the most lethal military systems ever devised. The Janissaries were the first standing professional infantry in Europe since the Roman legions. They had firearms before most European armies had even figured out the matchlock. They were the reason the Ottoman Empire stretched from Algiers to Baghdad. Now consider what they had become by 1826. The Devshirme system had been quietly abandoned in the 1600s. The corps was no longer recruited from kidnapped Christian boys, but from the sons of existing Janissaries. The rule against marriage had collapsed. The rule against owning private trades had collapsed. The rule against passing your position to your children had collapsed first and hardest. By the 18th century, A Janissary salary was a hereditary asset, like a piece of real estate. Fathers registered their newborn sons on the muster rolls. Infants drew Janissary pay. Dead men remained on the books for decades because their widows kept collecting the salary. Officers sold positions outright. Wealthy merchants bought their way into the corps purely for the tax exemption, the legal immunity, and the right to carry weapons in the streets. The Janissaries had become a hereditary protection racket. They controlled the coffee trade in Istanbul. They controlled the boat traffic on the Bosphorus. They controlled the bakery guilds, the meat markets, the porter unions. If you wanted to open a shop in the capital, you paid a Janissary. If you wanted to move goods through the Galata customs house, you paid a Janissary. If a Janissary owed you money, you did not collect. Imagine a modern major city in which the police department was simultaneously the largest organized crime syndicate, the dominant labor union, the primary slumlord, and a private army that could not be fired, audited, or arrested. Imagine that this organization had the legal right to depose the mayor, and that it had already done so multiple times. Imagine that every attempt to reform it ended with the reformer being found dead in his bathtub. That is roughly what the Janissary Corps had become. I find it striking how often history textbooks still call them elite soldiers in 1826. By that year, they had not won a serious battle in nearly a century. They had been crushed by the Russians, humiliated by Napoleon's expeditionary force in Egypt, and beaten repeatedly by the Greek rebels they were supposed to suppress. Their military function had collapsed entirely. What remained was the protection racket. Every sultan from 1700 onward knew the corps had to be destroyed. Not one of them dared to try. The price of trying was death, and they all knew it. Until Mahmud II. To understand what Mahmud did, you have to understand what happened to the man who tried before him. His name was Selim III, and he was Mahmud's first cousin. Selim came to the throne in 1789, the same year a mob stormed the Bastille in Paris. He was an unusual sultan. He composed music. He wrote poetry. He read French Enlightenment philosophy in translation. He kept up a correspondence with King Louis XVI of France until Louis lost his head, after which Selim was reportedly so disturbed that he stopped sleeping for weeks. Selim understood, with painful clarity, that the empire was dying. He could see the gap between Ottoman armies and European armies widening every year. He could see the corruption of the Janissary Corps. And he believed, with the gentle optimism of an educated reformer, that the problem could be solved through reason and patient negotiation. In 1792, he created a parallel army called the Nizam Letter 131 Sadid, the New Order. It was small at first. A few thousand men, drilled by French and Swedish instructors, equipped with modern muskets, organized along European lines. Selim was careful. He did not announce that this new army would replace the Janissaries. He insisted publicly that it was merely a supplementary force for frontier defense. He continued paying the Janissaries on time. He held banquets in their honor. He gave their officers court positions. He believed he could grow the new army quietly, year by year, until it was strong enough that the corps could be dissolved without bloodshed. He believed in gradualism. He believed in persuasion. The Janissaries were not fools. They watched the new army grow from 3,000 men in 1794 to nearly 23,000 by 1806. They watched the European drills, the new uniforms, the foreign instructors. They understood exactly what was coming. In May 1807, a regiment of auxiliary troops in the Bosphorus forts refused to put on the new European-style uniforms. The mutiny spread within 48 hours. The Janissaries in Istanbul overturned their cauldrons. They marched on the palace. Selim, who could not bring himself to order his own troops to fire on his own subjects, surrendered without resistance. He was deposed and locked in a small apartment in the harem called the Caves, the Cage. For 14 months he lived there, composing music on a small flute, reading, waiting. His cousin, the 17-year-old Mahmud, lived in the apartment next door. The two of them could speak through the wall. In July 1808, a loyalist warlord named Bayraktar Mustafa Pasha marched on Istanbul with an army from Bulgaria, intending to restore Selim to the throne. The Janissaries, hearing of his approach, made a decision that would echo through the next 18 years. They sent assassins into the harem. The killers found Selim in his apartment. He fought back with a small flute and a brazier. He cried out for help. According to multiple sources, the young Mahmud heard everything through the wall. By the time Bayraktar's men broke into the harem, Selim was dead on the floor, strangled with a bowstring. The assassins then came for Mahmud. He was hidden behind a rolled carpet by a servant girl named Sevri Kalfa, who reportedly threw hot ashes into the assassins' faces to slow them down. He survived by minutes. A few hours later, the 17-year-old who had just listened to his cousin being murdered was lifted onto the Ottoman throne. The Janissaries surrounded him at the coronation. They expected gratitude. They expected to be paid. For the next 18 years, that is exactly what Mahmud gave them. This is the part of the story that historians often pass over quickly, and I think it deserves to be sat with. Mahmud spent nearly 2 decades pretending. He smiled at the officers who had murdered his cousin. He attended their regimental feasts. He stood as godfather to the children of men whose fathers had strangled Selim. He paid their salaries on time even when the treasury was empty. He approved their tax exemptions. He laughed at their jokes. Selim had chosen to die a reformer. Mahmud chose to live a hypocrite, and he carried that choice for 18 years. What he was actually doing beneath the smiles was patient asset management of the most ruthless kind. He learned which Janissary officers could be bribed and which could not. He learned which artillery commanders held private grudges against the corps. He cultivated the Topsu Akagi, the artillery corps, which had always resented the Janissaries' political dominance. He quietly placed loyalists into the artillery and the navy. He sent officers to Egypt to study how Muhammad Ali Pasha had reformed his own army, taking careful notes on how the Egyptian ruler had massacred his Mamluk troublemakers at a banquet in 1811. He read history obsessively. He studied every previous sultan who had tried and failed. He understood, in a way Selim never had, that the Janissaries could not be reformed. They could only be killed. The only question was timing and pretext. By the early 1820s, the pretext was assembling itself. The Janissaries had failed catastrophically in the Greek War of Independence. They refused to fight effectively. They robbed Greek villages instead of suppressing the rebellion. Muhammad Ali's modern Egyptian army was sent in to do the actual fighting, which was a public humiliation that the entire population of Istanbul could see. The corps was now visibly useless. Even the bazaar shopkeepers who had once relied on Janissary protection were beginning to mutter that the white caps had outlived their purpose. Mahmud felt the moment arriving. In May 1826, he made his move. The decree was called the Eşkinçay Layihası. It ordered each Janissary regiment to provide 51 men for European-style military training. These men would drill with modern muskets, wear modern uniforms, and learn modern tactics. The decree was carefully worded. It did not abolish the corps. It did not even reduce the corps. It merely required a small portion of each regiment to learn new skills. On paper, it was a modest reform. In reality, it was the most precisely calibrated act of provocation in Ottoman history. Mahmud knew exactly what the Janissaries would do. He knew they would see the new drills as a Trojan horse, exactly as Selim's reforms had been. He knew they would overturn their cauldrons. He knew they would march on the palace. He was counting on it. This is what 18 years of patience had bought him. He was no longer trying to avoid a confrontation. He was engineering one, on his terms, on ground of his choosing, with his loyalists in position around the city. The Eşkinçay decree was not a reform. It was bait. On the night of June 14, 1826, Mahmud did not sleep. We have very few primary accounts of what he did that evening, but but the few we have are striking. He spent hours in the small chamber where the holy relics of the Prophet were kept. He consulted with the Shaykhul Islam, the chief religious authority of the empire, a man named Qadizade Maim Tahir Effendi, whom he had carefully cultivated for years. He met with the Grand Vizier and the artillery commander, a hard man named Maimed Husrev Pasha. The artillery was already in position. The cannons were loaded. The gunners had been paid in advance. I think about that night often when I read this story. Mahmud was 39 years old. He had been pretending for 18 years. He had smiled at men he was about to incinerate. He had attended the weddings of officers whose corpses would be dragged through the streets within 48 hours. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain that performance for nearly 2 decades, and then to spend a single night finalizing the trap, is something almost no modern person can imagine. He emerged from that night a different man. The reports from courtiers in the following days describe him as eerily calm, almost detached. The boy who had hidden behind the carpet in 1808 was gone. The Sultan who walked out of Topkapi Palace on the morning of June 15th was something colder, harder, and final. The cauldrons turned over at Maidani around midday. The Janissaries shouted their traditional grievances. They demanded the abolition of the Eshkinsai program. They demanded the heads of Mahmud's reformist advisors. They expected the usual response: negotiation, concessions, a few token executions to satisfy them, then back to business as usual. What Mahmud did instead has no precedent in Ottoman history. He ordered the unfurling of the Sankak Letter 131 Sharif. The Sankak Letter 131 Sharif is the holy banner of the Prophet Muhammad. According to Ottoman tradition, it was the actual battle standard carried by Muhammad himself in the 7th century. It had been kept in the Topkapi Palace for over 300 years, brought out only in moments of supreme religious crisis. Calling for the holy banner was the Ottoman equivalent of declaring holy war. It was a religious nuclear option. And critically, the Janissaries themselves had always claimed religious legitimacy through their association with the Bektashi Sufi order. They saw themselves as warriors of Islam. The holy banner was supposed to be theirs. Mahmud took it from them. He ordered the banner unfurled at the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, directly opposite the rebelling Janissaries in the Hippodrome. He summoned every imam in Istanbul. He sent criers through the streets calling on the citizens of the capital to gather under the banner. He had the Shaykhul Islam issue a fatwa, a binding religious ruling, declaring that the Janissaries were no longer Muslims. They were Baghi, rebels against legitimate Islamic authority. Killing them was not merely permitted. It was a religious duty. This single move shattered the Janissaries' entire ideological foundation. For 500 years they had claimed to be the swords of Islam. Now the empire's highest religious authority had declared them apostates. The bazaar shopkeepers, the theology students, the imams, the porters, the boatmen, all the people who had once paid protection money to the corps, were now religiously required to take up arms against them. Within an hour, Istanbul had turned. Crowds streamed toward the Hippodrome carrying whatever weapons they could find. Knives, axes, old muskets. The Janissaries, expecting another easy political victory, suddenly found themselves surrounded not by negotiators but by an enraged city. They retreated to their main barracks, the Et Maidani, the meat square near the modern Aksaray district. The wooden compound covered several acres. It was their fortress, their home, their headquarters. They believed they could hold it. They had always held it. They did not know that Maimed Husrev Pasha had been preparing the artillery for 18 years. The cannons were dragged into position around the barracks within the hour. The streets were narrow. The gunners had practiced the routes in secret. They knew exactly where each piece needed to stand for maximum effect. The Janissaries inside had old muskets and pistols. They had no artillery of their own. The artillery corps, which they had spent a century treating as inferiors, was now arranged around them in a perfect ring. Maimed Husrev Pasha gave the order in the early afternoon. The first volley of grapeshot tore through the wooden walls of the barracks at point-blank range. Grapeshot is a cannon round packed with small iron balls. At close range against unarmored men in confined spaces, it does not wound, it dismembers. The screams from inside the compound were reportedly audible from the Bosphorus. The second volley collapsed the front buildings. The third set the wooden structures on fire. By mid-afternoon, the entire Et Maidani was burning. Men who tried to flee through the gates were cut down by waiting infantry. Men who tried to climb the walls were shot. Men who tried to surrender were given no quarter, because the Shaykhul Islam's fatwa had declared them apostates, and apostates had no surrender rights. A few hundred Janissaries did escape into the surrounding streets. They were hunted through the alleys by armed civilians chanting the name of the Prophet. Their distinctive white caps, which had been a symbol of pride for 5 centuries, became an immediate death sentence. Men tore them off and tried to disappear into the crowd. It rarely worked. Their fellow citizens knew their faces. By sunset, the killing was largely complete. The estimates vary wildly because no one was counting. Some sources say 6,000. Some say 10,000. Some say 20,000 or more across the empire in the weeks that followed. The bodies in Istanbul were collected through the night and dumped in mass graves at the Serpisi meadow outside the city walls. No funeral rites were performed. The Shaykhul Islam's fatwa forbade it. The 500-year-old core that had carried the empire from a Balkan frontier state to a continent-spanning superpower had been destroyed in approximately 6 hours. The empire was now an empire without an army. This is the part of the story that often gets ignored, and it is the part that reveals just how cold Mahmud's planning had been. Destroying the Janissaries was the easy half. Building a replacement was harder because the treasury was empty. The Ottoman finances in 1826 were catastrophic. The wars with Russia had drained the treasury. The Greek revolt was burning through whatever remained. The empire's silver currency, the kurush, had been debased so many times that it was nearly worthless against European coin. There was no money to pay a new army. There was no money to buy modern muskets. There was no money to hire European instructors. Mahmud's solution was as ruthless as the massacre itself. He turned the destruction into its own financing mechanism. Every Janissary estate in the empire was confiscated within weeks. Their shops, their warehouses, their farms, their urban properties, all of it was seized by the imperial treasury. The core had been wealthy. Centuries of protection money, monopolies, and inherited positions had accumulated enormous private fortunes. All of it was now state property. Then Mahmud went after the Bektashi Sufi order. The Bektashis were the spiritual partners of the Janissaries. Their monasteries, called teks, had served as Janissary religious centers for centuries. Mahmud declared the order heretical, abolished it formally on July 8, 1826, and seized every Bektashi tek in the empire. Some of these monasteries had been accumulating wealth and land for 500 years. The revenue stream was massive. The new army was officially proclaimed on June 17, 2 days after the massacre. It was named the Asakiri Manjari Muhammadiyah, the victorious soldiers of Mohammed. The name was deliberate. Mahmud was claiming, through the very name of his new force, that the religious legitimacy the Janissaries had once held now belonged to him. Recruitment was forced and immediate. Provincial governors were ordered to send conscripts. European instructors were hired with the seized Bektashi gold. Prussian advisors arrived within months. The first uniforms were sewn from cloth confiscated from Janissary warehouses. The first muskets came from imports paid for with seized Janissary silver. It was, in its own brutal way, an extraordinary act of fiscal engineering. The destruction of the old army directly funded the construction of the new one. There was no transition period. There was no gap. The dead paid for their own replacements. I think about modern parallels here. A failed financial institution being broken up and its assets sold to fund the regulator that destroyed it. a corrupt government ministry being abolished with its real estate auctioned off to pay the new ministry that replaces it. The principle is the same, though the bloodshed is not. Mahmud was running an institutional liquidation with cannons instead of court orders. The formal decree abolishing the Janissary Corps was read in every major mosque in the empire on June 17, 1826. It was called Vaka-i-Hari, which translates as the auspicious incident. The name itself is one of history's great euphemisms. An incident, the way a city being firebombed, is an incident. Auspicious, the way a mass grave is auspicious. The decree did more than abolish the Corps. It abolished the memory of the Corps. The distinctive Janissary headgear was banned across the empire. Anyone caught wearing it was subject to immediate execution. The regimental insignia, which had been carved into mosque walls, government buildings, and fortress gates across 3 continents, was ordered chiseled off. The Bektashi monasteries were not just closed. They were physically dismantled, their stones repurposed for the new army's barracks. And then Mahmud did something that I find genuinely chilling, even by the standards of this story. He ordered every Janissary tombstone in the empire to be defaced. For centuries, Janissary graves had been marked with carved stone representations of their distinctive headgear at the top of the headstone. You can still see a few that survived, tucked away in obscure cemeteries. They are striking pieces of folk art. Mahmud ordered every single one of them chiseled off. Across Bosnia, Serbia, Anatolia, Greece, the Levant, Egypt, North Africa, wherever Janissaries had been buried in 500 years of conquest, local officials were sent with chisels to remove the headgear from the stones. This was not just an abolition. It was an attempted erasure of memory itself. Mahmud was trying to make it so that future generations would not even know what a Janissary had looked like. European diplomats watched the entire event with a mixture of horror and admiration. The Austrian ambassador, Baron Ottenfels, wrote dispatches describing it as the most decisive act of statecraft he had ever witnessed. The British ambassador, Stratford Canning, who had no love for the Ottomans, privately admitted that the Corps had become an incurable cancer, and that its destruction was probably necessary for the empire's survival. The Russians, who had been hopping to dismember the Ottoman state for decades, were openly disappointed. They understood that Mahmud had just made the empire considerably harder to kill. Within a year, the new Janissary Massacre army numbered over 27,000 men. Within 5 years, it had grown past 70,000. By the time of Mahmud's death, it had become a recognizable modern military force, with proper uniforms, modern artillery, European-trained officers, and a functional supply system. It was not yet a match for the great European armies, but it was no longer the joke that the Janissaries had become. Mahmud II died on July 1, 1839, at the age of 53. The official cause was tuberculosis. The unofficial cause, according to almost every contemporary observer, was a combination of chronic stress and a quietly destructive drinking habit. He had taken to consuming enormous quantities of French wine in his later years, which his physicians considered medicinal, and which historians now generally consider self-medication. The reports from his final years describe a man who could not sleep through the night. He kept lamps burning until dawn. He paced, he read history, he drank. What was he drinking against? Some of his court chroniclers, writing decades later under his son's reign, hinted that he had never recovered from the scale of the killing on June 15, 1826. Not the political consequences, which had gone exactly as planned. The actual scale: 6,000 men in one afternoon by conservative estimates, 20,000 by other counts. Mass graves at Serpisi. The bodies of men he had personally known, officers whose weddings he had attended. The chiseled tombstones, which he had ordered himself. He had won. He had outlived his enemies. He had built a new army, a new bureaucracy, a new system of provincial administration. He had introduced European clothing for officials, abolished the turban for state servants, created the first Ottoman postal system, sent the first Ottoman ambassadors back to European capitals after decades of absence. He had remade the empire from the inside. And he could not sleep. In his final months, he reportedly asked one of his closest advisors whether he would be remembered as the Sultan who saved the empire or the Sultan who slaughtered his own protectors. The advisor, with the practiced courtier's instinct for survival, told him he would be remembered as both. Mahmud is said to have smiled at that answer, the only honest one he had received in years. He was buried in a tomb on Divanialu Street in Istanbul, near the Grand Bazaar. The tomb is small by Ottoman imperial standards. He had ordered it that way. The man who had erased an entire institution from the empire's memory was, in his final instructions, almost modest. When we look back at the Janissary Massacre true story, we are forced to sit with a question that has no comfortable answer. Mahmud II was not a clean man. He spent 18 years lying to the faces of men he was planning to kill. He weaponized religious authority in a way that turned ordinary citizens into killers of their own neighbors. He ordered an entire institution erased not just from the present but from the past, scraping the names of dead men off their own gravestones. By any modern standard of leadership ethics, his actions are indefensible. And yet the empire he inherited in 1808 was so far gone that no contemporary observer, foreign or domestic, believed it would survive another generation. The core that was supposed to protect it had become the primary threat to it. Every previous sultan who had tried to reform that core had been murdered for the attempt. Selim III had chosen gentleness and persuasion. He had been strangled with a bowstring while his young cousin listened through a wall. Mahmud chose differently because he had seen what gentleness bought. He carried the weight of that choice for the rest of his life. The drinking, the insomnia, the small tomb. These are the marks of a man who knew exactly what he had done and did not pretend otherwise. The empire he saved survived for another 96 years after his death. It survived Russian wars, Balkan revolts, the partition schemes of European powers, the long catastrophe of the First World War. It was finally dismantled only in 1923 by reformers who would have been impossible without the institutional foundations Mahmud had built on the ashes of the Janissary core. The Turkish Republic that emerged from those ashes inherited his ruthless modernizing instinct, his willingness to abolish institutions that had outlived their purpose, his comfort with the necessary cruelty of state surgery. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. The institutions that protect a nation are not eternal. Sometimes they curdle. Sometimes the guard becomes the threat. And when that happens, the question facing a leader is not whether the institution should be reformed, but whether reform is even possible, or whether the only remaining option is destruction. Mahmud II answered that question with cannons. He may have been a butcher. He may have been a surgeon. He may have been both at once, in the way that history's most consequential figures so often are. So I want to leave you with the question he asked his own advisor in his final months. Was he the Sultan who slaughtered his own protectors, or the Sultan who saved a dying empire by cutting out a tumor that would have killed it anyway? Was the auspicious incident an act of butchery or an act of mercy? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone, and I am genuinely curious what you think. Hit the like button if you found this story worth your time. Subscribe for more deep dives into the brutal, complicated, uncomfortable corners of history where heroes and villains refuse to stay in their assigned roles. I look forward to walking through another forgotten afternoon with you next time.